Well, hello everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. Hopefully everyone can see the slides. But my name is Olivia and I'm joined today by our team of ecologists from Lodge Environmental. So we've got Jack, Max, Luke and Henry, and we are very excited to talk about biodiversity stewardship agreements. Before we get stuck in, a couple of rules. We'll just ask that the people here just keep themselves muted just while we're presenting so we don't have any interfering noise. But if you do have any questions throughout, we do encourage you to raise your hand. There's a raise your hand function, or you can pop a question in the Q&A and we can pause at the end of some slides and take any questions, or we can also take questions at the end. This webinar is also being recorded, so just keep that in mind, but we'll get started. So first, a little bit about us as a company. We are an independent ecological consultancy specialising in biodiversity stewardship agreement space. So this includes setting up BSAs, conducting targeted species surveys, assisting with credit sale and transfer, and the monitoring and facilitation for the full biodiversity offset scheme lifecycle. One element that I think sets us apart from others in the space is that we don't just go out and assess the land, but we help landholders make informed strategic decisions about high-value environmental assets. We are also very proud to be a certified B Corp and a 1% for the Planet member. We have been operating for 8 years and now have a team of 12 ecologists across 2 offices to service the entire state. Within this team, we currently have 3 accredited assessors. And over the years of working and specialising in the BSA space, we have facilitated the conservation and management of more than 3,000 hectares of land under BSAs. And now Jack will tell you exactly what is a biodiversity stewardship agreement.
Okay, thank you, Liv. Yes, so it is hard to cover a BSA in one slide. So we'll be delving deeper into the process through the rest of the slides. But just to get going broadly, what is a BSA? So it's a completely voluntary buying the land. Once it's in place, it is in perpetuity. So it's a forever commitment for conservation management that goes on the land title, and it is irrevocable. It's an agreement between you as the landholder and the Biodiversity Conservation Trust. So you commit to managing the land to improve its biodiversity value, and in return, you generate biodiversity credits. So the receipt of those credits, that's where the economics come into play. So those credits are then able to be sold, the sales of which funds the management in perpetuity, as well as the aim is that also generates a profit. So essentially, in exchange for forgoing development potential of your land or farming potential of your land, you're then making a profit through the sale of the credits. And yeah, for a good site, it can be a worthwhile endeavour, whilst also so in terms of conservation as well as finances as well. Now, a key point to highlight is the agreement stays with the land, but the credits don't necessarily. So the management obligation, that will be on the land title. If you sell the land, the requirement to manage the land in perpetuity passes on to the subsequent landholder, but you can sell the land and take the credits with you. So yeah, just making that distinction there. Now, a BSA, so the BSA package, it's underpinned by 3 main components. We have the BSA, the Biodiversity Stewardship Site Assessment Report. That quantifies the biodiversity and defines the credit types that you'll be receiving. The total fund deposit, so that's the TFD. It's a big spreadsheet. It's broken down annually and outlines the costs for the management each year. And then we have the management plan itself. So that outlines the annual management that you'll be doing in perpetuity. Now, for landholders entering a BSA, it introduces a diversified income, and it's a really practical way to integrate conservation onto a working property. We see that it's quite beneficial for landholders thinking about intergenerational estate planning. So it can provide confidence for ongoing land ownership with the perpetual funding that comes through the TFD, which also results in the removal of land tax, and you can build the cost of land rates into the TFD as well. We also see a lot of action from investors, sort of looking to get into the space from the investment perspective, where they might be trying to corner high demand credits and do sort of that process I mentioned earlier, where you'll set up the site, generate the credits, keep the credits, but sell the land. And then the third area we tend to see clients coming to us is if they're developers themselves and they have the opportunity to set up a site on their land that they're developing, which will provide the credits for the development that they're doing themselves. Now, the process is certainly a difficult one to navigate for people that aren't experienced in the space. So we very much try to hold our clients' hands through the process. I mean, even when it comes to the acronyms, there's about 20 acronyms. Most of them start with B. We've listed a few there on the side. So there's a lot to learn through the process. And yeah, hopefully this presentation will bring some light to into the process. And yeah, just a note on the picture that we have there. I've included that, so that's just to give you a snapshot of what a BSA can look like. So some stunning land there, giant Eucalyptus viminalis with greater gliders living within it, so generating some good credits. But that is actually the back of a farm, and whilst it doesn't look like a farm, it was sort of considered useless hill country, but the introduction of the BSA brought in a way to bring in a diversified income stream from otherwise useless considered land that's actually really good and suitable for conservation. I'll hand back over to Liv now, who's going to detail the 3 core components.
Thanks, Jack. So as Jack touched on, there are 3 main elements that make up a BSA. So we have the Biodiversity Stewardship Site Agreement Report, or BSA, the Total Fund Deposit, or TFD, and the Management Plan, or MP. So for the BSA component of the package includes Stage 1 and Stage 3 of the BAM, which first assesses and describes the biodiversity values on the land, and then it outlines the predicted improvement in biodiversity values based on the required management. So the report will summarise all of the field work. It outlines validated plant community types, candidate species, targeted survey. It summarises the management actions and provides the generated credit outcomes. And for the BSA, there is a mandatory government report template that includes all of these required components, and that is, of course, what we use. Then we have the TFD, which is the total cost to deliver the management required as part of the BSA. So the TFD includes a line item for each management action required, so it directly correlates to the management plan. And the costs are broken down annually for 20 years, but it also includes ongoing costs past the 20 years. And the landholder will receive annual management payments that continue in perpetuity in line with the established TFD. And another thing to note is the TFD amount is set aside from the first credit sales, with all of the first credit sales going towards the TFD until the full amount has been set aside. And then we have the management plan, which details all required management. So this includes fencing, gates, erosion control, access tracks, weed management, threatened species habitat management, if that's included, fire management, and ongoing ecological monitoring. The management plan can also detail any chosen active management. Now, active management is totally optional, but it can be included in the form of active plantings, habitat enhancement, or more active management of high threat weeds. These management items will increase the site's credit yield, but of course, it will also increase the cost of the TFD, so the cost of management. So now on the next slide, I'll chat a little bit about the process. Tim, could you please change it? Awesome, thank you. In terms of the process of getting to a completed BSA package, we do suggest 3 steps which assist in confidence in investing. So first we have a feasibility assessment, And this can be either desktop-based or informed by fieldwork. As is in the name, a feasibility assessment will provide an overview of the site's feasibility to become a BSA. For this, we use largely unvalidated model data points, and we can provide a high-level feasibility analysis. We leverage the state vegetation type map to predict the vegetation that may be on site, and then we use the corresponding offset trading groups to get a credit yield estimate for the site. And we also look at any likely candidate species. So the report considers both ecosystem credits and species credits. Now, this step is optional, but highly recommended, as any work we do in the feasibility assessment feeds into subsequent stages. And next we have a business case report. So this goes a little bit further than a feasibility assessment and will meet government established minimum detail requirements. And once complete, this report can actually be used to qualify participation in BCT credit auctions, which can allow for early credit sale through auctions. This can, of course, assist with confidence in progressing to a full BSA package, as you can potentially lock in early credit sales, which is great. To meet minimum detail requirements, a business report will include vegetation zone mapping and the completion of a subset of plots, which is usually one plot per vegetation zone. So this does include field work, the business case. A business case is also optional, so this step's also optional, but can be useful to further explore the feasibility before jumping into a full package. For example, to confirm certain vegetation types or even explore species credits. And as I said, the business case report can then be used to participate in BCT credit auctions, which can be really beneficial. Then, of course, we have the full BSA package, which includes the BSA, the TFD, and the management plan, as I described on the previous slide. The field component includes a handful of weeks surveying in which we stratify the entire site. We complete all required vegetation integrity plots, conduct targeted species surveys, and collect data to determine any management requirements, such as monitoring current pests or recording any weeds we come across. This stage includes the completion of all reports, mapping, and compilation of data, and then submission into the government's portal BOEMS. Following this, the package is then reviewed and approved by the BCT's relevant body, which currently is the Conservation Planning and Offsets Division. Now, depending on their capacity and the site's complexity, this can take anywhere from 3 months to over 12 months. But in this time, we work directly with the review team to ensure that any comments or feedback are resolved and implemented as efficiently as possible. And then once the BSA is drafted and it is provided to the landholder for signing, and the credits are issued once signed. So that's a bit about the process. Now I'll hand over to Luke to show you some visual examples of data and maps that are included in our BSA reporting.
So these next two slides are a small sample of the maps that we prepare as part of the BSA package, from the feasibility assessment all the way through to the BSA. Largely, the maps just visually represent the text of the report and just help further justify our findings. The CPO division, who Liv just mentioned, review the BSA package can be quite prescriptive with what and how the data is shown on maps. That has its pros and cons, but generally the aim is to help streamline or simplify the reporting and review process. So these first two maps show the offset trading groups mapped across one of our sites where we have done some prelim mapping, and the the offset trading group area of demand, which I'll touch on a bit more in a couple of slides. But basically that second map there, it shows the IBRA subregion of the potential BSA site. It's covering 2 IBRA subregions in this case, and all the other IBRA subregions within a 100-kilometre radius or buffer, and that effectively shows the demand area of the credits for that BSA site. On the next slide, we have 3 maps from the BSA, which so the first one is a location map. It gives a general broad context of the site and the characteristics of the area for the BSA site. The second one is a map of the PCTs. I particularly like this map because it shows a bit of a glimpse into the field work that we actually do for the BSAR. This one in particular shows the vegetation zones and the VI plots conducted across the site. And the third one is a monitoring map. The monitoring map shows all the monitoring points in accordance with the management plan and where management actions might be required. All of these maps, and we can generate other maps, can be split or simplified as needed to show more specific details, such as certain species surveys or where management actions are required, such as ecological burns and so on. On the next slide, we talk about the credit types. Overall, credit types can be a bit confusing, but from a simplistic point of view, there's just two credit types, being ecosystem credits and species credits. But before I jump into those, I'll just go into how credits are generated on a site. So credits are generated on a BSA through the anticipated improvement or gain to biodiversity values through conservation and management on a site over a 20-year period, not for the vegetation that's currently present on a site. Current site conditions do form a basis for credit generation, but it is the improvement or gain that is where credits are generated from. Without management, a site is assumed to naturally decrease in biodiversity value over time from a range of pressures such as weed encroachment or pest species. But under a BSA, it is expected biodiversity values would increase through management actions. This increase or gain is where the credits are calculated from. As I was saying before, biodiversity credit categorization can look confusing at first glance, but from a simplistic view, there are two types, being ecosystem and species credits. Ecosystems are typically the main or the bulk of credits a BSA site can generate. This type of credit is a measure of biodiversity value of the vegetation communities, which are also known as plant community types or PCTs, and they provide habitat for a range of threatened species that can be reliably predicted to occur within that vegetation community. You can have several types of ecosystems generated across one BSA, but they are dependent on the vegetation communities present on the site, whereas species credits are a little more nuanced. Species credits measure the value of suitable habitat for certain threatened species, which are also known as candidate species under the BAM, and they can't reliably be predicted to occur within vegetation communities on a site. This is because these species often rely on habitat constraints or microhabitats such as caves and hollows suitable for breeding or shelter, presence of watercourses, or certain ecological niche habitats such as moss gardens. There are a whole range of habitat constraints that the BAM considers, and they are very species specific. As species credits are less predictable without at least some level of ground truthing, they are optional for BSAs and often end up being a decision between cost to survey and likelihood of detecting the species compared to the credit price and demand. So in practice, ecosystems group the reliably predictable threatened species and their habitat together and are calculated based off the biodiversity value of the communities present on the site, whereas species credits are for individual threatened species. They require targeted surveys to confirm presence and are calculated based off their niche or microhabitat. And Max will touch on this in an upcoming slide. And then on the next slide, we have offset trading groups. So as we had the map on a previous slide, I've copied it across here as well, just for ease of explaining. Offset trading groups, or OTGs, are the currency of ecosystem credits. They are what is traded or retired by purchasers and fund a lot of the BSAs. OTGs represent broader categories of vegetation communities with the aim of allowing for a more simplified purchasing and selling process, whilst ensuring offsets are relevant to the specific biodiversity being impacted by a project. OTGs are largely categorized based on vegetation formations, such as dry sclerophyll forests or rainforests, and the level of historical clearance. So the categories are less than 50%, 50 to 75, and greater than 75% clearance, and their location, which is IBRA sub-region based again. Trading rules govern the types of credits that can be purchased to offset an impact on biodiversity. The trading rules for OTGs as well. These were established under the BC Reg in 2017. The trading rules state that the credits have to be purchased from the same or an adjoining IBRA sub-region as the impact site, any sub-region within 100 kilometres of the outer edge, and if the impacted site does or does not impact hollow-bearing trees. So the first two rules effectively provide the demand extent for ecosystem credits generated by a site. So in this one where we have the map here, the BSA site covers 2 IBRA sub-regions, so you buffer that by 100 kilometres, and that's essentially your credit demand area. And now I'll pass on to Max, who will talk a bit more in detail about how species credits are generated.
Yes, thank you, Luke. So yeah, I'll talk through the 2 main steps involved in generating species credits. This is a process that's typically done during the base assessment for a BSA. It can also be done once a site's established. There are some considerations either way, which I won't go into too much here, other than to say the easiest way is to do it as part of that base assessment. So the first step is the targeted survey. So the BAM calculator provides some guidance on which species are to be considered based on known vegetation associations. So with this information essentially acting as a bit of a start point for us. It's not an exhaustive list, as some species don't have well-defined associations, or they're under-surveyed, overlooked in some areas. So once we've got that list, we'll end up selecting species to pursue via survey. This will be based on our understanding of the site, species in question, as well as what's realistic. So some species will have a slim chance of being detected, maybe very expensive to detect, or they could just be species that has low demand from a credit perspective. So once we've narrowed down our target species list, we'll develop a site-specific survey program. Program's generally designed in response to not only the species we're targeting, but the site itself. So different survey methods will work better in some conditions than others. Things like seasonality play into this. So whether a species is calling at a certain time of year, peak activity periods, that sort of thing. The methods as well need to be considered. So some methods that'll work in flat country might not work if you've got deep gullies, dense vegetation. Something like spotlighting for greater gliders, for example, it's a pretty easy process if you've got a flat site. It becomes significantly more costly if you're dealing with deep gullies. So in that case, we may opt to use something like thermal drones to detect them. Ultimately, in the end, we need to weigh up which option will be suitable for the site while maximising the probability of detecting that species. In some cases, you can have species detected via multiple methods. Something like the squirrel glider, for example. We can detect them via camera trapping, spotlighting, or bioacoustic survey. So what we end up using really will depend on the site, but also the other species that we're going for. Where possible, we do try to target multiple species via one method. That concurrent survey just brings in extra efficiency into our survey plan. We can also garner a more robust view of a site. So bioacoustics, for example, it's a good opportunity to incidentally detect species that we may not otherwise be on site to see. Yeah, so much as possible, implementing numerous survey methods is always the way to go. So the targeted surveys obviously sort of focused on those candidate species to generate credits. But if we do get nil detections, there's still sort of, I guess, side results from these surveys. For example, we can detect cats, foxes, pigs on site, which then assists with justifying management actions down the track. eDNA, for example, they can also be used to boost detectability of some species, but also gives a bit of a view of what other species might be visiting an area. So the second step in generating species credits is determining the species polygon. So this essentially refers to the credit generating area. How we define a species polygon is typically governed by survey guidelines. If there's no specific guidance, the polygon footprint will usually default to the vegetation zone from which the species has been detected. So that can be a sizable area. Some vegetation zones might be hundreds of hectares. They might be down to tens of hectares, just depends on the site and the vegetation. So to generate credits, we first need to establish that the candidate species is actually present. In some cases, a species will have certain habitat requirements, as Luke mentioned, which must be present in order to generate those credits. So powerful owl, for example, requires vegetation that contains hollows of a certain size. Large-eared pied-bat requires caves, which they roost and breed in. So for credits to be generated, you'll need those requisite features. on site, and then also detect the species on top of that. So I guess one of the most common questions on species credits is how many can be generated. Fortunately, it's relatively straightforward once you have those kind of two previous steps sorted. So credit yield for species credits basically mirrors ecosystem credit generation. So if you've got a vegetation zone that's generating 5 credits per hectare and you detect powerful owl, you'll also receive 5 credits per hectare for that species. So it's a pretty effective way to boost revenue from a site, diversify the credit outcome, which just helps with, I suppose, downstream feasibility of a site. So I'll hand over to Henry now, who will continue the discussion.
Thanks, Max. So the financial viability of your site largely comes down to the value of the credits you generate. High value credits can facilitate the creation of much smaller BSA sites, provide room for you to discount your credits to accelerate sales, and also encourage active management that wouldn't be justifiable otherwise. There are over 400 different types of credits, and each one has a unique price, ranging from as low as $100 up to $70,000 per credit. Credit pricing is market-based for the most part. However, the BCT operates the Biodiversity Conservation Fund, or BCF, from which developers can buy credits that have never actually been generated. The price quoted by the BCT for these credits effectively sets a maximum price. However, these prices do vary between locations and do change over time. Beneath this price, credits are traded in an open, competitive market where supply and demand influences pricing. Credit prices can be inferred from a number of sources. A few that we like to use, we'll picture over the next few slides. If we jump to the next one. So here we have the credit sales dashboard, which provides a snapshot of the current market. It also provides some useful statistics for specific credit types and locations as well. If we jump over to the next slide and look under the hood a little bit. So this is the BCF charge report, which keeps a record of all quotes issued by the BCT and helps us keep track of the sort of ceiling price for credits. Over the next slide, we have the credits transactions register. This logs every credit transaction, including type, quantity, price, location, and some other details as well. It provides us with a real-world view of the credit values and allows us to analyze trends in pricing and demand. Then finally, we also have several budding sort of online marketplaces where you can find credits currently listed for sale. You can see a number of credits that have been listed for sale on Calm Mango here, but ultimately the current supply and demand for your prospective credits will impact the price that they will sell for and how quickly you can sell them, as we'll cover on the next slide. Thank you, Tim. Right, so as we've covered, the Biodiversity Offset Scheme aims to protect ecosystems and threatened species from the impacts of development. The demand for credits, therefore, is driven by the interaction between developments and ecosystems and threatened species. Some are more frequently impacted by developments than others. This might be because their area of occurrence overlaps with consistent high rates of development. An example of this is ecosystems and threatened species occurring in Western Sydney, where residential development presents a continuous impact to biodiversity. Others tend to occupy landscape positions favoured by a variety of developments. Grassy woodlands across central New South Wales and the species that inhabit them are often impacted by energy, infrastructure and transport projects. Sometimes developers can offset their own obligations by using land adjacent to their projects to establish their own stewardship sites. The viability of this varies between projects based on size and the type of credits that are required. Demand for credits that suit this method is often lower, whereas credits that are present within but not typically available adjacent to the development footprints tend to be in higher demand. The supply of credits isn't directly related to demand. Ecosystems and threatened species that occur in large patches in remote areas or difficult terrain are often not impacted by developments, but frequently owned as bush blocks that at face value might appear to be ideal BSA sites. These types of credits tend to be in high supply and can be very difficult to sell. Credits with a low supply have often been subject to historical land use, resulting in fragmentation or elevated land values that make it hard to justify a feasible BSA site. Ecosystems and species that are restricted geographically or difficult to detect also tend to be in low supply. You can use some of the sources from the previous slides to gain an understanding of the existing supply of your credits and also where the demand lies, which is key to selling your credits in a timely manner. That brings us over to our next slide. So there are two approaches to selling biodiversity credits. Selling in the private market relies on direct or indirect interactions with developers who need your credits. Reaching the right developers can be difficult to begin with, but the government provides registers and catalogues in which you can advertise your credits. A similar service is offered by several online marketplaces, as we showed with Carmango previously, that allow you to list your credits and facilitate any sales for a fee. There are also brokers who provide a similar service using their networks to connect you with potential buyers. Several times a year, the government runs auctions and tenders that provide credit holders an opportunity to sell their credits. There are two variations of this. The BCT typically runs 2 tenders a year where they seek to acquit the obligation they gained by selling credits to developers from the Biodiversity Conservation Fund. The Biodiversity Credit Supply Fund is another branch of the state government that aims to assist the offset scheme by purchasing credits upfront in reverse auctions based on forecast demand and selling them on to developers when they need. The latest reverse auction actually opened on Wednesday this week, and we'll be accepting bids up until the 6th of May. Successful participants will have about 6 months to provide the credits. As Olivia mentioned previously, a major benefit to the government approach is that you can participate early in the assessment process and have sales locked in long before the establishment of your BSA site. Understanding the government tenders, as well as navigating the private negotiations and transactions required for credit sales can be very daunting, but we offer our assistance and guidance wherever we can. I'll hand back over to Jack now, who's going to go over what sort of value a BSA site can produce, as well as the costs involved in establishing a BSA.
Thanks, Henry. Yes, so the million-dollar question, how much money will a site make? It's not an easy question to answer. So I'll go into, the first place to start is the upfront costs. And then we'll work through an example of what financial benefit might come from a theoretical site. So the sort of piecemeal approach to increasing your understanding about a site that we recommend is to commence with a feasibility assessment. There are sort of a lower price option, $500 to $2,000 amount, that uses desktop data and just starts to piece together what credit types are likely to be generated, how many, and are they in demand, all really critical information. If it's looking like very low demand credits that have a low sale price, then obviously it's unlikely that you should proceed to the next step, being the business case. The business case, that's a higher price amount, sort of $15,000 to $30,000 amount. The reason why there's a considerable jump up there is because there is a set amount of field work required to have a full business case report that qualifies for participation in the auctions that Henry just mentioned earlier. Substantial amount of field work in a subset of vegetation integrity plots so that you have a very confident understanding of what credits you're likely to then generate at the site. Then the third step in the recommended process is to progress into the full Biodiversity Stewardship Agreement package of reporting. And that the price range there is we've got $100,000 to $150,000. There's a considerable price range there. It's a considerable investment as well, but the variation is because the BSA sites, they vary significantly in terms of size, location, and targeted survey that we're going to be doing. So that full BSA includes the BSAR report, the TFD, the management plan, submission through to the Conservation Planning and Offsets Division, and then approval as well. So they're the main fees that we would charge through a process. Again, trying to provide information in a step-by-step process so you don't have to jump all the way down to that option 3 there that is a high investment amount. Other fees, there's also the submission fees to the BCT. They're currently around $3,500 for your submission of your BSA. Once you get your credits, you then also have to pay credit trading fees to the government. So when you do a credit transfer, there is a fee that accompanies that to cover the government's costs for their legwork. And then just other sort of ancillary costs, so accounting advice and legal advice as well, if you want to get that, which we do recommend. So we'll work off by once all is said and done, you might have spent $150,000 to get you to the point where you've received your credits. So it's a substantial amount of money up front. So, but what could that look like in terms of a financial return? So working through let's go with a theoretical 200 hectare property, off a conservative 4 ecosystem credits generated per hectares, that gets you 800 credits. Now we'll use $4,000 per credit in this example. That $4,000, it's a good example to use because that's about the average for an ecosystem credit type related to box gum woodland. It's a highly liquid credit. So there's been 29,000 of these credits sold to date. So a substantial amount. So highly liquid, highly likely that you'll sell those credits at that ish amount. If you did that at this particular property, that would total to 3.2 million. From that 3.2 million in credit sales, the first amount of sales has to go towards filling up the TFD. A TFD for a property of this size is likely to be in the range of the $1.5 million amount. And then you've got your setup costs as well, $150,000. So once you minus the management costs in the TFD and the setup costs, there's a net of about 1.5 million in profit. But just a note on the TFD, that leaks out annually to the landholder. We cost up the management in our management plan and TFD, but if you get the management undertaken for a cheaper amount, then that is also profit. So there's room to bring in efficiencies once you're actually active managing the site to introduce further profit. Now, with this example, one thing to also mention here is that it looks very different if your credit price was $1,000 per credit. Obviously, that site then doesn't look viable. So that sort of touches on the importance of the feasibility assessment. You want to know that up front. Otherwise, you'll get through a very expensive process to then realize that it's not financially worthwhile endeavor. So feasibility assessment, very important. Similarly, if the credit prices were double that, which is not unrealistic, as Henry mentioned, there's a very big range in credit pricing. If you had credits around the $10,000 mark, again, that example looks very different in a positive direction. So yeah, knowing what credit types you have and are they highly liquid credits is critical. So we'll just move on to the next slide. Thank you, Tim. So other considerations. So the first one I have here is land eligibility. Not all land is eligible. Things like easements, transmission lines, plans by council or state government for road widening, dial before you dig where you've got underground services and local land services potentially having earmarked your land for other uses. That all has to be known up front. Otherwise, you might be submitting a BSA that's not eligible. So we can advise on that. Capital gains tax, that's an item that landholders often balk at. We found an accountant that specializes in that area, and we very much encourage everyone to chat with them. We're not affiliated with them, but it's a niche area of accounting, and understanding capital gains is critical. Similarly, for the type of ownership structure that you might have for the property, there's efficiencies there as well. So we advise, if you're considering progressing to sign the BSA, chat with an accountant. Really just hammering home the point that it's a perpetual covenant on title. It is forever. So just making sure that you know you're signing into something that is enduring on the land. Then similarly, the management requirements, they have to be done. If you don't do the management, the Biodiversity Conservation Trust will note that in their annual inspection, and they'll freeze the TFD funds. So you won't then get access to that money that's leaking out for management. Restrictions on future use. So the BSA locks up the land for conservation management only. So if you do have plans, for instance, ecotourism, or you've got planned roads that you want to run through the property, we need to know that up front, and we'll exclude those from credit generating areas. Which is fine. We just need to do it before the BSA is signed off. There's a landowner application form. The reason why I've added that as a consideration is it's a really good first starting point for a landowner new to the process to start to learn what's required. It's a really nice instructional document, and we really want our clients to be learning through the process, because they're the ones that will be actively participating in the management of their site. And then, just the upfront costs, which I've mentioned in the previous slide. Certainly a situation where you've got to spend money to make money. It's a considerable investment. but hopefully for a worthwhile return financially and in terms of a conservation outcome. Finally, for other considerations, just the timing as well. So the feasibility and the business case reports, they're sort of a few weeks to a few months, dependent on our capacity to turn those around. And then the full BSA package, so the field assessment and the BSA drafting, we can get that done in as quick as 3 months, but 12 months is often we advise for 12 months because you get the seasonal coverage of the species that will be active and not active through that year. So if you're wanting to maximise your potential candidate species inclusion into the credit generation, covering a full season is quite often beneficial. We then submit the BSA to the CPO, the Conservation Planning and Offsets Division, and they work off a sort of best case 3-month time horizon for their approval, but it is dependent on their capacity. On average, probably best to work off a 6-month time period there. The best we've achieved is a BSA complete in 3 months from our side and then approved in 3 months from their side. So 6-month turnaround is possible. And then the credit sale, that is market dependent. We can't obviously guarantee on what the market conditions will be next month, but we hope that the information that we provide in our feasibility assessment does sort of inform what things can, like you can expect things to look like into the future. So yeah, the point there, BSAs, they are strategic and long-term plays. They're not short-term transactions. I'll now hand over to Max, who's going to detail one of our favourite BSAs that we've been a part of.
Yes, thank you, Jack. Yeah, I got a bit of a case study for a great BSA that we've been involved with on the South Coast. All up was about a 350 hectare site with a vast majority of that put under a BSA. There were some areas that were excluded for potential ecotourism ventures, on-site housing, that kind of thing. So it was a pretty complex site in terms of the vegetation communities that were present. It had everything from rainforest through to swamp forests that required a bit of kayaking to get around in. All of that vegetation translated into ecosystem credits for 5 offset trading groups, which allowed for pretty good opportunities to sell credits across numerous regions. The landholders had good handle on which species were on site, which helped with the feasibility side of things. Stemming from that understanding, we were able to develop a robust survey program to determine how widespread those species were on site, as well as add a few new ones to the properties list. So all up, we detected 12 candidate species, with credits generated for 8 of those species. So the reason credits weren't generated for the others largely came down to the absence of confirmed breeding on site. So there was white-bellied seagull, square-tailed kite. They can generate credits, but we're required to confirm nesting on site, which we didn't have. But they're species that could be added in future if they do end up breeding on site. So it's a pretty lengthy project. It ran for about 3 years. Within this time, the scope had changed a little bit, as well as additional species surveys also adding time. So I guess that kind of comes back to the points. The more we know up front, the better we can advise, as well as just, yeah, what else you want to get out of a particular site. Some key decision points for this site included fencing, mainly around which style of fencing was to be installed. We also had to consider the costs for active restoration, so replanting areas that were previously cleared for grazing. That replanting does add cost to a TFD, but in this case, it also allowed for a significant additional tranche of credits to be generated, which helped boost the site's viability. So there's been a few key sales lining up, but there's some big considerations here as well, mostly to do with ensuring that the sales will fill the TFD or get close enough, as well as having a bit of a buffer for tax implications. So that's been something that's delayed the sort of smaller credit transactions being accepted. So the agreement for this site has been approved and is now basically pending the landholder signing off on it before the credits are generated and can then be sold. It's a great outcome to get to that point, and now it sort of just stands a bit idle while those sufficient credit sales are lined up. So jump to the next slide. So as we know, there's a lot that goes into determining whether a BSA is a good fit, both for the landholder as well as the land itself. So things like entry costs, management expectations, and credit demand can all stifle the feasibility of a BSA. There are other options, though, to see land conserved and, under some scenarios, receiving ongoing funding to manage native vegetation. Somewhat adjacent to a BSA are voluntary conservation agreements. There are also agreements that are established by the New South Wales Biodiversity Conservation Trust and come in a few different shapes and sizes. Generally, if the land is above about 20 hectares, contains threatened species or other important habitat, it may be eligible. VCT periodically run fixed price offer campaigns which target different regions. These offers set a fixed price per hectare, which is then paid on an annual basis for the term of the agreement. So those agreements are usually in perpetuity, similar to a BSA, but there can be shorter fixed term agreements, typically around 20 years. The assessments for these agreements are a bit leaner than a BSA. They run through the BCT. There are no credits involved. Rather, you receive, basically just funding to manage the land. I suppose that's an aspect that's quite different. The BSA, you can leverage decent profit out of the correct site, whereas through a fixed price offer, you'll just receive that flat fee per year to manage it. In some cases, those agreements can then be turned into a BSA later on. So should something like credit demand spike in the area that your property's in, you can potentially opt to alter that agreement into a BSA, but you can't go vice versa. So once you're in a BSA, you're locked into that one. Another option that I'm currently assisting a landholder with is selling the land to New South Wales National Parks and Wildlife Service. So this was a case where we did feasibility assessment for a BSA and concluded that it wasn't feasible. Landholders didn't want to hold on to that block anymore as they no longer have the capacity to manage it. The process to sell or at least offer land to national parks is relatively straightforward. They have a reserve establishment unit. They have a list of criteria that they consider, but there's no minimum requirements. So the land is assessed on a case-by-case basis. The valuation process is done in pretty fair manner and is basically built off land valuation that council rates are sort of pivot from. It typically works best if you've got land that is within national park boundaries or adjacent to a national park. So there's a few other mechanisms as well, things like this organisation called the Reindeer Trust, which can facilitate private conservation agreements, land for wildlife. There are, I guess, alternative ways to have land conserved where payment may not be the primary motivator. Ultimately, there's no real clear answer to what the best private land conservation mechanism is. There are options to suit most scenarios and expectations. I guess the best first step is just to get in touch, have a conversation, and we can advise where to go from there.
All right, so hopefully what we've done today through the presentation is to demystify the Biodiversity Stewardship Agreement process in terms of the opportunities, the practicalities, and the realities. I think from my side, if there's one key takeaway, it's just setting clear expectations up front. So doing the right feasibility before proceeding so that, you sort of have an understanding that the site is going to be a viable one and you don't end up at the end of the lengthy, costly process with a site that's not going to sell credits. If you're even slightly considering a BSA, we love having discussions around new sites. So we very much welcome calls, emails, setting up meetings, more than happy to have those. So if you're interested, feel free to use our information there on the screen now to get in touch with us. And yeah, we'd love to help understand whether your land's suitable, what credits it might generate, and whether it's worth proceeding further into a full BSA. On behalf of the team at Logic Environmental, thanks again for joining us. And we look forward to continuing to work in this space, potentially with your properties.